July 7, 1944, Saipan, Mariana Islands. Dawn had not yet broken, but the jungle was already awake. A heavy, breathless humidity clung to the air, bending the tall cane grass as if the island itself knew what was coming. The distant rumble of boots, thousands of them, pulsed through the ground like a heartbeat growing faster with every second. Inside a canvas field hospital pitched only yards behind the marine front line, the smell of antiseptic mixed with burned coral dust. Dozens of wounded lay on stretchers, some whispering, some silent, all waiting for a chance at survival. In the center of the tent stood a man wearing a Red Cross armband. His uniform was smeared with the blood of men he had never met before that week. His hands, trained for delicate dental work, moved with calm precision as he checked bandages and stabilized the injured. His name was Captain Benjamin Louis Salomon, a U.S. Army dentist temporarily assigned as a battlefield surgeon. Outside, the sound grew louder, shouting in Japanese, the crack of rifles, the crash of grenades. A massed banzai charge, the largest of the Pacific War, was breaking through. Salomon looked toward the tent entrance, knowing the next minutes would decide who inside lived, and who wouldn't. And it was in that fragile moment that his role would shift from healer to something fate never intended. Before Benjamin Salomon ever stepped onto Saipan's shores, his life unfolded in a world far removed from jungle warfare. Born in Milwaukee in 1914, he grew up in an America still recovering from the First World War, an era when military service meant discipline, technical skill, and above all, specialization. Dentistry, like medicine, was not a battlefield profession. It was a craft of precision, patience, and care. Salomon excelled early. At the University of Southern California's Dental College, he was known for his steady hands and quiet confidence. Classmates described him as calm, focused, and almost impossible to rattle. When he graduated in 1937 as a doctor of dental surgery, his path seemed set. A stable, respected civilian life in a growing profession. But the world was changing faster than anyone expected. By late 1940, Europe was burning. Nazi Germany had overrun Poland, Norway, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Britain stood alone under bombardment. The United States remained formally neutral, but mobilization was underway. The army needed trained personnel, engineers, doctors, dentists, professionals capable of building and sustaining a modern fighting force. Salomon was drafted in 1940. At first, he served exactly where the army placed him, the Dental Corps. He wore the insignia of a medical officer, not a combat soldier. Yet even then, fellow servicemen noticed something uncommon about him. During training exercises, he showed a natural talent with infantry weapons. He received top scores with the M1 Garand, the Browning automatic rifle, and even crew-served guns. One commanding officer remarked, with a hint of irony, that the unit's best rifleman was their dentist. But military needs are never static. As America prepared for the possibility of a wider war, officers with multiple skills gained attention. Salomon was transferred to the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division. Though still a dentist, he now lived and trained alongside frontline soldiers, men who would soon be fighting across remote islands thousands of miles from home. By 1941, tensions with Japan were spiraling. Tokyo's expansion had already consumed Manchuria, Korea, and much of Southeast Asia. Pressure on the U.S. increased as Japanese forces pushed deeper into the Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 would bring the United States fully into World War II, reshaping Salomon's destiny. The Pacific theater became a brutal, unforgiving battleground. Terrain dictated everything: dense jungles, razor-sharp coral reefs, diseases, and relentless heat. Combat was close, chaotic, and often hand-to-hand. The Japanese Imperial Army fought with a doctrine centered on endurance, aggression, and absolute refusal to surrender. Their commanders demanded death before capture, and infantry tactics reflected that ethos. As the war progressed, the U.S. strategy of island hopping aimed to seize key positions across the Pacific, gradually closing in on Japan itself. Each island captured allowed construction of airfields, supply bases, and naval staging points. But every island also required fierce fighting, often with catastrophic casualties. By 1944, attention turned to the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands held unparalleled strategic value. From the Marianas, American long-range bombers could reach the Japanese home islands for the first time. Their capture would sever Japan's defensive perimeter and bring the war into a new phase. Knowing this, Japan prepared to defend Saipan to the last soldier. The 43-square-mile island became a fortress. Over 30,000 Japanese troops dug into the cliffs, caves, and ridges. Civilian populations were woven into defensive zones. Bunkers, machine gun nests, and hidden artillery pieces turned the landscape into a deadly maze. When the U.S. invasion began on June 15, 1944, the Marines and Army units faced immediate, staggering resistance. Beaches clogged with obstacles, snipers hidden in palm groves, artillery raining from concealed positions, the island erupted into one of the most intense battles of the Pacific. As casualties mounted, medical support became critical. Aid stations, though marked with the internationally recognized Red Cross symbol, offered no guarantee of safety. Japanese forces frequently targeted medical tents, knowing the removal of doctors and medics could break an entire battalion's ability to survive. This was the environment Salomon walked into when he deployed to Saipan in late June 1944. Still technically a dentist, he volunteered to serve as the frontline surgeon for the 105th Infantry Regiment's 2nd Battalion Aid Station when the previous physician became a casualty. It was a role far more perilous than anyone outside the medical corps could imagine. By early July, the fighting intensified. Japanese positions collapsed steadily toward the north, and desperation replaced strategy. Intelligence suggested the enemy might launch a final, large-scale attack, a massed banzai charge, one of the most feared tactics of the Pacific War. Inside the aid station, Salomon worked nearly non-stop. Casualties arrived in waves. Some carried on makeshift stretchers, others stumbled in on their own, bleeding heavily. The tent became a sanctuary and a graveyard, depending on how quickly help could reach each man. And all the while, Japanese forces were gathering strength for one last attempt to break through the American line. The pressure building outside the medical tent was about to erupt into the most violent morning on Saipan. By the first week of July 1944, Saipan's once lush landscape had been reshaped into a shattered battleground. The beaches where U.S. Marines landed were now littered with burned-out landing vehicles. The cane fields were flattened by shell fire. Hillsides were carved open by naval guns. What remained standing often hid something dangerous: snipers in palm trees, machine gun pits dug under volcanic rock, or camouflaged trenches extending deep into the interior. The Japanese 43rd Division, once positioned in orderly formations, had disintegrated into clusters of exhausted survivors. Many were wounded, many were starving, but they were still determined to fight. Their commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, understood the hopelessness of the situation but refused surrender. Messages intercepted by U.S. intelligence made this clear: Saipan would be defended to the final man. The American front, stretched thin across the northern portion of the island, relied on every available medic, corpsman, and surgeon to keep battered units functioning. Aid stations were established close to combat lines so the wounded could be treated within minutes, but proximity came with risk. Enemy infiltrators sometimes slipped through at night. Mortar rounds landed closer than anyone liked, and during heavy engagements, field hospitals could receive more men in 1 hour than they were designed to handle in an entire day. The 105th Infantry Regiment's 2nd Battalion Aid Station, where Captain Benjamin Salomon served, was positioned near Tanapag Plain, a relatively open stretch of terrain framed by palm groves and rising hills. The station consisted of canvas tents arranged in a rough semicircle, with supply crates and stretchers stacked along the edges. A large red cross hung at the entrance of the main medical tent, signaling non-combatant status. But the symbol offered little assurance this deep into the battle. Inside, the air was heavy with heat and the metallic smell of blood. Nurses and medics moved constantly, improvising as supplies ran short. Salomon, though a dentist by commission, had assumed full responsibility as the battalion surgeon after the previous doctor was incapacitated. He stabilized chest wounds, set fractures, controlled arterial bleeding, and performed emergency procedures far beyond the scope of dental training. Fellow soldiers were astonished by his composure. One medic later recalled that Salomon worked as if the tent was a peacetime clinic, even as machine gun fire cracked overhead. Throughout July 6th, the number of incoming casualties increased sharply. Patrols reported growing Japanese movement in the hills. Survivors from shattered enemy units were drifting south, gathering in pockets. Intelligence officers noted higher than usual radio chatter. As dusk approached, scouts confirmed what commanders feared. Thousands of Japanese troops were consolidating behind a narrow ridge west of the American line. A banzai attack, overwhelming, all out, and suicidal, was imminent. This was not the first time American forces had faced such an assault, but what was forming on Saipan dwarfed anything previously seen in the Pacific. It was a culmination of desperation and military doctrine. Saito issued his final orders. The remaining soldiers, along with armed laborers and lightly equipped sailors, would charge as one massed force at dawn. Their objective? Break through American lines, reach the coast, and inflict maximum casualties before death. That night, the jungle pulsed with the sound of movement. The low murmurs of Japanese preparations drifted through the trees. Officers sharpened bayonets. Soldiers wrote farewell notes. Some carried grenades tied to their bodies. Others affixed swords or bamboo spears. When the attack began, it would be a tidal wave of men driven by resolve rather than strategy. Inside the aid station, Salomon and the medical team worked through the dark hours. Wounded Marines and soldiers continued to arrive from outlying positions. Many were barely conscious. Others clutched rifles even as they were placed on stretchers. Instincts still wired for survival. The tent filled rapidly, until nearly every cot was occupied. Shortly past midnight, gunfire erupted sporadically along the front line. Probing attacks, small infiltrations, testing American readiness. At one point, a Japanese soldier slipped through the outer perimeter and attempted to crawl into the aid station. Salomon subdued him before he could attack a patient. It was a sign of what was coming. By 3 a.m., the atmosphere inside the tent was taut. Medics exchanged quiet glances. Everyone sensed the pressure building outside, like a held breath waiting to collapse. Steady waves of wounded were carried in, many reporting heavy troop buildups in the darkness. Salomon stepped outside briefly. The eastern horizon hadn't yet begun to glow, but his ears caught what eyes could not. Thousands of voices murmuring, the creak of equipment, and the rhythmic stamping of men preparing to charge. The jungle ridge in front of the American line felt alive with movement. He returned to the tent without saying a word. A few hours later, as the first faint light began to touch the sky, the Japanese attack would burst forward with unimaginable force, straight toward the front line and straight toward the medical station that had become its next target. And from inside that tent, Benjamin Salomon would soon face the decision that would define the rest of his life. In war, stories often begin with rank, regiment, and orders. But Salomon's story begins with something simpler. A man who believed his purpose was to heal. Those who served beside him before Saipan remembered an officer who never sought attention. He was the kind to hold back a joke until the moment tension broke, the kind who volunteered for unpleasant tasks without being asked. His patients trusted him immediately. Even under chaotic battlefield conditions, he carried a calm that steadied those around him. During the days leading up to July 7th, Salomon's humanity was tested endlessly. He treated Marines whose faces were burned by explosions. He stopped severe hemorrhages as machine gun fire snapped outside the canvas walls. He worked on wounded who arrived shaking with fear, some apologizing for taking up his time, not realizing they were minutes from dying without help. Medics later said he rarely rested. When the aid station overflowed, he didn't hesitate. He knelt on the dirt floor, using his own legs as support for bandaging and splints. To the wounded, he was a calm voice in the storm. To the younger medics, a mentor who showed them how to hold pressure on a wound without letting his hands tremble. But beneath this calm exterior, Salomon knew the situation was deteriorating. Every hour brought more casualties from the outer lines. Every stretcher carried a story of Japanese forces pushing harder, closer. He listened to these accounts while stitching wounds, while checking pulses, while rationing morphine. He understood that if the Japanese broke through, the aid station would be defenseless, filled with men unable to move. This awareness forced him to quietly prepare himself, emotionally and mentally, for the moment when healing would no longer be enough. And that moment was approaching fast. Military doctrine states that aid stations must be positioned close enough to the line to allow rapid evacuation, yet far enough to avoid direct enemy engagement. On Saipan, that balance was nearly impossible. The terrain around the 105th Regiment's aid station created both opportunity and danger. The open plain allowed fast movement of stretchers, but it also exposed the tents to enemy observation. Small ridges, ravines, and brush lines provided perfect avenues for infiltration. By July 6th, American commanders knew Japanese remnants were moving through these natural channels, searching for weak points. The Japanese tactic of massed banzai charges was designed to overwhelm defenses through sheer force and momentum. Soldiers advanced in waves, shouting loudly to intimidate and disorient. The purpose was not precision, it was psychological shock. If successful, the charge would collapse a segment of the front, allowing follow-up units to pour through and exploit the breach. Aid stations were never intended to withstand such impacts. When the Japanese prepared their final assault on Saipan, they faced no illusions. They understood they would die. Their objective was to kill as many Americans as possible before they fell. This mindset made medical facilities especially vulnerable. Killing the wounded meant erasing American manpower. Killing medics meant eliminating recovery capability. On the tactical map, the 2nd Battalion aid station sat directly behind a segment of the line that would receive the full weight of the attack. Hundreds of American soldiers were exhausted, low on ammunition, and spread thin across a wide defensive arc. Commanders suspected an assault, but underestimated its scale. They believed the Japanese force had been reduced to only a few thousand fragmented troops, In reality, nearly every remaining soldier, infantryman, naval personnel, garrison troops, even civilian auxiliaries, had gathered for the charge. When the banzai attack began, it would strike the exact corridor leading straight to Salomon's tent, and that ensured that the next angle, technology, and weaponry would become central to the battle for survival. War reduces every object to its function. The canvas tent becomes a refuge, a stretcher becomes a lifeline. And in the final hours of July 7th, a Browning automatic rifle became the instrument through which a dentist tried to save dozens of lives. The bar, introduced in World War I, was not a machine gun, but a portable automatic rifle capable of delivering sustained fire. It fired 36 rounds, heavy, fast, and devastating at close range. In trained hands, it could cut down charging infantry before they closed to bayonet distance. The weapon had a rate of fire of roughly 500 rounds per minute, but efficient soldiers used short, controlled bursts to preserve ammunition. Salomon understood weapons. Though he wore a Red Cross armband, his earlier infantry training meant he knew exactly how to handle rifles, pistols, and the bar. This skill was rare among medical officers, who typically had minimal combat instruction. But Salomon's proficiency was not born from desire. It was shaped by necessity. The Pacific War often blurred the line between soldier and medic, especially when Japanese forces targeted aid stations to collapse American support. The Japanese soldiers preparing the banzai charge carried an assortment of weapons. Many held Arisaka rifles with fixed bayonets, simple, rugged, and deadly in close combat. Others carried knee mortars, Nambu pistols, or improvised explosives. Some were armed only with spears or grenades tied to their bodies. Their doctrine favored closing the distance quickly, overwhelming defenders with numbers and hand-to-hand combat. Against such tactics, automatic fire was the only realistic deterrent. Inside the medical tent, however, the bar was not initially part of the environment. Medics were unarmed. Wounded men were unable to fight. The tent was meant to be a neutral space, protected under the laws of war, but Japanese forces repeatedly violated those protections across the Pacific, considering medical units as priority targets due to their strategic value. When the Japanese broke through the front line in waves, pushing wounded Marines back toward their own aid station, the battlefield moved with them. The tent was no longer behind the line. The line was collapsing into it. In such a moment, the difference between survival and massacre could depend on a single weapon, and on the one man inside the tent who knew how to use it. Leadership in wartime is often portrayed through grand strategies and battlefield commands. Yet true leadership is frequently found in moments unseen, decisions made quietly, without witnesses, where the cost is personal and the rewards go unrecognized. Salomon's leadership emerged not through rank, but through responsibility. As Japanese infiltrators began slipping through the perimeter on the night of July 6th, he sensed what awaited them. He had seen enough battlefield patterns, heard enough reports, and treated enough wounded to know that a massive assault was approaching. The medics around him were younger, tired, and overwhelmed. Some had been working for more than 20 hours without pause. Salomon kept them focused, giving short, clear instructions, moving efficiently from one patient to another. When the first Japanese soldier rushed into the tent at dawn, everything changed. Salomon drove him back, subdued him, and immediately understood what this meant. The enemy had reached the hospital. More would follow. At that moment, leadership demanded action beyond medical care. He ordered the medics to begin evacuating the wounded. Those who could walk were helped toward the rear. Those who could not were lifted onto whatever could be used: stretchers, crates, even pieces of torn canvas. He did not raise his voice. According to surviving medics, his tone remained steady, almost clinical, as if directing a complex procedure. Then came the moral weight of the decision that defined him. He told the other medical personnel to leave the tent. They protested. Some wanted to stay and help defend the wounded. Others insisted he come with them, that his life was just as important. But Salomon saw the situation clearly. If no one delayed the Japanese advance, none of the wounded would escape. Someone needed to hold the line long enough for the others to flee. He chose to be that person. The Red Cross emblem protected him under international law, but the battlefield offered no such protection. Once attacked, medical officers were permitted to return fire, but this was not a mere return of fire. This was a deliberate stand. His decision was not driven by aggression, but by duty to the helpless men around him. Leadership in war sometimes means making the choices no one else can bear. And as Salomon stepped toward the entrance of the tent, lifting a rifle in hands once meant only for healing. He knew the moment had arrived when every skill he possessed, medical, moral, and martial, would be tested at once. Ahead of him, the sound of the banzai charge was becoming a storm. And that storm was seconds away from crashing into the aid station. The storm arrived at dawn. At approximately 5 a.m. on July 7, 1944, the Japanese banzai charge, one of the largest of the entire Pacific War, erupted across the front lines of Saipan. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers, many wounded, many carrying improvised weapons, surged forward in a single roaring wave. They poured down the slopes, across ravines, through brush and shattered cane fields, screaming as they charged. The 105th Infantry Regiment was the first to absorb the impact. Exhausted American soldiers were overrun in minutes. Machine gun crews fought until they were surrounded. Riflemen were pulled from foxholes. Mortarmen fired their tubes point-blank into the massed crowd. Though the Americans inflicted heavy casualties, the sheer momentum of the Japanese assault drove them backward. Entire companies were pushed into disarray. Some were cut off completely. And behind that collapsing line stood the 2nd Battalion Aid Station. Inside the tent, the wounded heard the thunder first, a rolling roar of voices, rifle cracks, and explosions. Then came the screams from the outposts closest to the perimeter. Medics rushed to help stretcher teams. Others grabbed what instruments they could carry. Men who could walk tried to help their comrades. Those who could not looked toward the entrance of the tent with eyes filled with dread. The first Japanese soldiers burst through the flaps of the aid station moments later. One lunged at a wounded Marine still lying on a cot. Salomon reacted instantly, striking the attacker, then firing the small pistol he kept holstered as a medical officer. 2 more Japanese rushed in. Salomon shot one and tackled the other, disarming him before pushing him back out of the tent. The sudden violence confirmed what he already knew. The station was no longer behind the battle. The battle was inside the station. He shouted for the medics to begin evacuating. Now, immediately. They scrambled to obey. Some grabbed wounded Marines under the arms. Others used discarded rifles as improvised crutches. The scene became a blur of urgency and fear. Salomon stepped to the tent entrance and saw the unimaginable. The banzai charge, spreading like a flood, was sweeping directly toward them. Dozens of Japanese soldiers surged across the clearing. Some carried rifles with fixed bayonets. Some held grenades. Others, already wounded, limped forward with knives, swords, or nothing more than willpower and rage. The American riflemen who had been guarding the aid station were already overwhelmed. Salomon knew the next seconds mattered. A fallen soldier beside him had dropped a rifle. Salomon seized it and opened fire in short bursts, instinctively using the weapon as he had during infantry training years earlier. He dropped several attackers, but more filled the gap. As the rifle emptied, he moved back into the tent and retrieved a Browning automatic rifle from another fallen Marine. The bar transformed the entrance into a defensive choke point. Salomon planted himself at the flap, firing in controlled bursts to slow the attack. Medics carrying wounded men glanced back at him, watching a dentist become the final barrier between life and slaughter. They later recalled the sound, the chattering rhythm of the bar, the thud of bodies falling into the canvas, the sharp snap of incoming rounds piercing tent walls. But the Japanese force was relentless. Several soldiers rushed the entrance at once. Salomon cut them down, but absorbed a bayonet wound to his side during the struggle. He did not fall back. Instead, he repositioned himself outside the tent, so the fighting would not spill onto the wounded inside. There, in the first light of morning, he fired again, sweeping the area in front of the tent, forcing a brief pause in the enemy advance. It was not enough to stop thousands, but it was enough to buy seconds. Seconds that meant survival for the wounded being carried to safety. A medic shouted that the last of the wounded were moving to the rear. Salomon did not turn around. He simply continued firing. Japanese soldiers began trying to flank the tent. Salomon shifted position, firing from behind supply crates. He killed attackers trying to slip between tents. He shot others attempting to drag wounded Marines from stretchers. Every movement he made placed him between danger and the men he'd spent days trying to save. As he pulled back to another position, a fallen tree near the side of the tent, he laid down suppressive fire to cover the retreating medics. Several attackers charged him at once. He shot two with the bar before using it as a club to knock down a third. A fourth soldier stabbed him with a bayonet. He fought him off and continued firing. By now he had been hit multiple times by bullets and blades, but his position held, and still the charge kept coming. The roar of the battlefield, the chaotic movement of men in every direction, the heat of rounds passing inches from his body. This was the full weight of the Japanese assault, concentrated on one man holding a line meant to be impossible. But Salomon's stand was not meant to defeat the Banzai charge. It was meant to delay it. And with the medics still evacuating the last of the wounded, he continued to give them every second he could. Seconds he bought with his life, and those seconds were running out as the Japanese closed in from all sides. The story of Captain Ben L. Salomon did not end with the silence that followed the Japanese assault. His fellow soldiers found him the next day, slumped over a machine gun he had fired until the barrel glowed and the ammunition ran dry. Around him lay nearly 100 enemy dead, a number later counted with sober astonishment by officers who understood exactly what such resistance meant on Saipan. All of it done to buy time for the wounded to escape. All of it done by a man who had not even been assigned a rifle. Yet, despite the magnitude of what he had done, recognition did not come quickly. In the chaotic aftermath of the battle, paperwork was lost. Eyewitnesses had been killed, and strict wartime regulations, particularly the policy preventing medical officers from receiving certain combat awards, complicated any attempt at honoring a dentist who had fought like an infantry captain. His commander, Lieutenant Colonel William J. O'Brien, who also fell during the same Japanese attack, had intended to recommend him for the Medal of Honor. Without O'Brien's testimony, the nomination stalled. For decades, Salomon's story lived only in the recollections of survivors. Corpsmen who escaped because he held the line, doctors who remembered him as quiet and dedicated, and wounded soldiers who never forgot the man who refused to abandon them. They passed it down quietly, almost solemnly, as if unsure the world would believe that a dentist could have done what he did. It was not until 1969, when the Army Dental Corps began researching its wartime history, that his name resurfaced. Reports from Saipan were re-examined. Surviving witnesses provided written statements. Slowly, a picture began to take shape. A picture of a man who had made a decision no textbook could ever prepare him for. Still, bureaucratic obstacles remained. Regulations needed to be changed. Legal interpretations of wartime status had to be revisited. The process dragged on for years, but the persistence of the Dental Corps, the advocacy of veterans, and the weight of the historical record eventually proved undeniable. Finally, on May 1, 2002, nearly 6 decades after he made his final stand, President George W. Bush awarded Captain Ben L. Salomon the Medal of Honor. The citation described his extraordinary heroism and the supreme sacrifice he made while defending wounded soldiers under his care. His family accepted the medal, their hands steady, but their voices quiet, as the nation recognized what the men on Saipan had known all along. In the years since, Salomon's story has taken its place among the most extraordinary acts of courage in World War II. Not because he sought glory, but because he embodied a truth common to so many battlefield heroes. That duty can transform ordinary men into something far greater. Today, his Medal of Honor hangs as part of the Army Medical Department's legacy, reminding generations of medical professionals that compassion and courage are not opposites. They can exist together, even in the darkest hours of war. And with his recognition complete, the focus returns not simply to how Captain Salomon died, but why he chose to stand his ground when retreat was still possible. That choice leads into the final reflection, a broader look at what his sacrifice reveals about humanity, war, and the weight of moral responsibility. When the dust settled on Saipan and the war moved on to other islands, Captain Ben L. Salomon's final act remained frozen in time. A moment where one man accepted a responsibility far larger than himself. His story is not simply about the number of enemies he killed, nor even the ferocity of his defense. It is about the quiet, unwavering conviction that the wounded under his care were worth any sacrifice, including his own. War often reveals the worst of humanity. Cruelty, destruction, and loss on a scale difficult to comprehend. But within that same chaos, there are rare moments when the very best qualities emerge. Salomon's stand shows how courage can come from the most unexpected places. He was trained to repair teeth, to ease pain, and to restore smiles in a world consumed by violence. And yet, when the line between life and death narrowed to inches inside that aid tent, he proved that compassion is not just an emotion, it is an action. His sacrifice also reflects a deeper truth about military service. Titles matter less than character. A dentist can become a defender. A healer can become a shield. And a man who never sought combat can become the final barrier between the wounded and annihilation. In Salomon's case, the transformation came not from ambition, but from duty, the kind of duty that does not wait for orders or recognition. Today, his legacy endures not only in his Medal of Honor, but in the quiet pride of soldiers, medics, dentists, and doctors who learn his story. It endures in the understanding that moral courage can be just as powerful as physical bravery. And it endures in the reminder that even in the most desperate moments of war, humanity can still shine through. Ben L. Salomon did not survive the battle for Saipan, but his actions ensured that others did. His final stand remains one of the clearest examples of selfless devotion in the entire Pacific War, a testament to what a single individual can choose to do when every second counts and every life matters. And so his story closes where it began, with a man who went to war to heal others and found, in his last moments, the fullest expression of what it means to serve. Before you go, if stories like Captain Salomon's move you, stories of courage nearly erased by time, of men who stood alone so others could live, then don't let this be where the journey ends. Subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss another untold or forgotten chapter of history. And if there's a hero you believe the world should remember, a story buried, overlooked, or never told, share it in the comments. Your suggestion might become the next voice we bring back from the silence.